Hi, and welcome to a reading of It's Real George, a young adult science fiction adventure novel by author L.R. Prime. It's available as a paperback or Kindle download on amazon.co.uk or amazon.com, and the links to these have been left below. If you'd like to hear more or you have any questions, then do let us know in the comments, and please hit the subscribe and alerts buttons to catch more videos and follow the author. So this is an excerpt from Chapter 2, Looking for George. By the time Silkris realised it wasn't their expected visitor approaching, there just wasn't time to reach the transmesh, their powerful shape-changing device which was still mimicking George Mollett's tent. So she gave out the ultrasonic call to abort the plan and hide, and did the only other thing she could think of. Aiming at the tent/transmesh's emergency hide switch, her humane gun shot out a water pellet right on target. Come on, she said, as the tent/transmesh started folding in on itself, seeming to take forever, just 5 seconds in reality. The folding process got faster and faster, occasionally scraping the soil as it flipped this way and that, until the only remaining evidence of the transmesh was a small plastic card laying on the ground where the tent had been, which for the moment would have to stay where it was. She returned her gaze from the transmesh card back to her people, who had already melded into the surrounding plants and trees, to all intents and purposes invisible. They could only watch as Mrs. Mollett came blundering into the clearing. As she approached, Mrs. Mollett had thought she'd heard something going on through the trees, a sort of whistling, thrashing sound, but standing there now, she could see nothing except Mr. Mollett's carefully laid out planting area. Multicoloured flowers, carrots, turnips, runner beans, potatoes, and some other stuff she didn't recognise, all planted in straight lines with several bamboo structures for netting and plants to climb. However, there was no Mr. Mollett. "George," she called. "George, love, come out, wherever you are." No answer. "George Mollett, I know you've seen me arriving because I heard you rushing to hide. Now come on, stop messing about." She was about to giggle and shout again. Then, "Wait a minute," she said. There was evidence of some sort of scuffle on the ground, and some bamboo sticks had been broken at the edge of the allotment. Then she noticed a piece of plastic lying right in the middle of the scuffle marks. She hurried over and picked it up. Strangely, it felt warm. "Hang on, it's a credit card," she said as she turned it over to see who the owner was. "George Mollett? Why, it's George's credit card." This didn't feel good, because if it was his credit card, then maybe he'd been in the scuffle and dropped it. He could be lying hurt somewhere. It was then that she heard the crack of twigs underfoot. "George!" The movement stopped. Her eyes darted around, penetrating the shadowy trees, looking for the source of the noise, while her stomach tightened slightly. Something had clearly happened, and now there was a sound again. Something was coming towards her. Her imagination raced into overdrive. Shaking fingers fumbled frantically with her mobile phone, and she cursed the stupid plastic flowers on the cover that were hindering her progress. She didn't use it very often, and now, in her haste, she couldn't remember how to select the touchpad to dial out. Then he was there. The boy from earlier. The very same one she'd come to tell George about, just standing on George's allotment. The cheek of it, with George still unaccounted for. "What are you doing here? It's got something to do with you, all this, hasn't it?" "What do you mean?" he asked in a shaky voice. "I've got it, look, here it is," she said, holding up the credit card, which was now becoming quite hot in her hand. "You're something to do with this scuffle, aren't you? That's why you're hurt, and you came back for George's dropped credit card, didn't you? You little thief, and to think I felt sorry for you." "But that's not my credit card, mine's still at home." "Stop trying to confuse me, young man. The card is my husband's, but you thought you'd come back for it anyway, didn't you?" He started fumbling again with her mobile phone. "I'm calling the police, so no point in running off again," she said, holding onto his sleeve. Unknown to Mrs. Mollett, or the now young George Mollett, The transmesh, now pretending to be his credit card, was programmed to perform an almost unlimited variety of useful functions, but mainly it was there to protect George. Sensing the anger in Mrs. Mullet and noting that she was pointing a possible weapon, the phone, at George, it jumped out of Mrs. Mullet's hand, and they both watched in disbelief as it transformed, spinning and unfolding as it did into a huge, mean-looking robot. Young George stood frozen in a mixture of wonder and horror as the robot from his previous childhood drawings and imaginings, with all the colour detail and power-ups he had thought up, took shape in front of his eyes. 8 metal legs, each the thickness and half the height of a lamppost, with piston-assisted joints and tank-like roller tracks for feet, supported a war-scarred torso that resembled a metal-plated gorilla. Its arms were an assortment of power cannons and lasers to cover every eventuality, with claw-like hands at the ends. Although battered from conflict, its entire metal body still dazzled with a beautiful golden sheen, throwing its golden beams over the tree trunks and leaves around them. An intelligent computer brain sat inside a golden metal skull with a gaping jaw fixed in a continuous silent war cry under 2 piercing, red, glowing camera eyes. He'd imagined the robot up over 50 years ago, and although science fiction had moved on since then with much more streamlined, scary robots in all the films he'd watched, this, he reminded himself, was real and looked extremely evil. For what could only be a couple of seconds, it seemed to hold steady, like someone testing their senses and being blindfolded and spun around at a party. Mrs. Mullet, presumably thinking this would be a good time for her and the boy to forget their differences, moved towards George, holding out a hand and frantically gesturing for him to follow. The metal menace jerked its head towards her, then without warning, cleared the distance to where she cowered at lightning speed. Grabbing her held-out arm, it lifted her clean off the floor, which was the point at which Silkris and Fernop materialised, in order to stop a catastrophe. Thanks for listening, and if you enjoyed it, then don't forget we've left the links below if you'd like to buy the book. Bye.